So welcome everyone to our virtual presentation. Let's begin the program. I'm going to ask Hal Scarab to make our introductions. The floor is yours, Hal.
Thank you so very much, milady. Well, I'm going to tell you a little short story. This place, this river we live on, was once a hotbed of rebel activity. There were rebels on the river. And as Gary, who's been talking to me about the story, once told me, he says, by the way, Hal, did you know you have an ancestor who joined them? And I went, what? Oh, yeah, one did. The others did not. The planters here didn't care much for the people who came up from New England, the invaders, because they pushed us off our land. They renamed the part of Nova Scotia New Brunswick after the German king, and then stuck their boat on the flag. We were not very happy about that. Anyway, to tell you something about that, I need to tell you about Gary. Major, retired, Gary Campbell. He's a former logistics officer. And as you've perhaps been watching on the television these days, an army without logistics support fails miserably, as in the past and the present. He served in all three environments while he was with the armed forces. And he was posted from sea to sea to sea and points in between. His out-of-country tours included visits with the Military Sea Lift Command of the United States Navy, with the Ministry of Defense in the UK and London, England, and he had previous service with 3RCR in London, Ontario, and with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, big mouthful there. His areas of specialization were in transportation and logistics planning and host nation support, something that our Russian adversaries these days sadly lack and something the Ukrainians seem to have grasped. He has a BA and an MA in War Studies through RMC and a PhD at UNB. Therefore, he is Dr. Gary to the rest of us. Military history is one of his great interests, especially logistics history, of course. He's written several articles about this and authored 2 books in the Brunswick Military History series. His wife, Carolyn, is a former Air Force nurse, lots of military connections to refer on, and they have 2 married daughters and 4 grandchildren. His recreational activities include collecting militaria and membership in the local historical groups and the Seniors Club. He also volunteers with the Royal Canadian Legion, and he's a past president of the York-Sunbury Historical Society. The story and the tales that he's going to tell you this evening should be hyper interesting. Again, particularly since I'm related to it, I'm a little biased there. I really think you're going to enjoy this. Gary, I'm going to hand over to you. Have a good one.
First of all, I'd like to thank Linda for this wonderful graphic. It's really nice. I was quite impressed by it. So Linda, thank you very much. Going to the main title, as you know, the subject is Rebels on the River, the American Revolution in Western Nova Scotia. Now, I think this is a snappier title than the one I previously used, which was New Brunswick, the 13th and a half colony to rebel. Rebels on the River has a certain zing to it, eh? And that pretty much sums up my title this evening, the American Revolution in New Brunswick. This is an episode in New Brunswick history that is not well known, and my goal this evening is to try to correct this. Other times I've given this, I tried to get a bit philosophical and talk about, loyalty and what creates loyalty and how does rebellion flourish. I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to give you a good old-fashioned hardcore military history. Another thing we were talking about just before we came on air was the Semiquincentennial of the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence happens 4 years from now in 2026. And it's my belief that the New Brunswick tourist industry that has suffered so badly during the COVID pandemic would be well advised to hop on this bandwagon, because you will see when the presentation is over, there's lots of things in New Brunswick to talk about, and it would be a great hook to bring the American tourists in, especially for the cruise trade. And at the end of the presentation, some of you who have deep roots along the river are going to have to perhaps ask yourself a question. Who are you going to join? Are you going to join the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada? Are you going to join the Daughters of the American Revolution? Or perhaps both? So my talk's going to focus on Western Nova Scotia, Sunbury County, which, as we all know, eventually became New Brunswick. And just to christen the ground in good old military fashion, we'll start here in Machias, another hotbed of rebel activity. We'll move up the coast. Where did my mouse go? Here, mouse. There we go. Musquash Cove, Fort Frederick, come up the St. John River. Majorville, the Oromocto Portage route figures into the story. Up to Okpak and up to Meductic and the Eel River Portage route. Both these portage routes eventually lead you back to Machias. Coming back up the coast, there's Sheppardy, and of course, Sackville and Fort Cumberland. Now, I'm going to give a bit of a background to this, because if you know what's going on in the main theater of the Revolution, it'll help you to better understand what happened in Western New Brunswick. Well, of course, the Revolution broke out in 1775, and the Patriots, I'm going to call them Patriots, although sometimes it might slip into rebels, because that's what they were quite convinced that the French living in Quebec would open their arms to them and join them. So they invaded Quebec. 2 invasion routes, rolled the British back into the citadel at Quebec. They attacked the citadel on New Year's Eve in 1775. The attack failed. There's a stalemate until the spring of 1776, when the St. Lawrence River was open to navigation. And of course, British reinforcements came and pushed the Patriots or the rebels, having trouble keeping a grip on this mouse, all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. Meanwhile, down here, the British troops had concentrated in Boston, and the Patriots brought in artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, and they had to vacate Boston in May of 1776 off to Halifax. And then in July of 1776, they came back to New York City, and the Revolutionary War continued. The following year, 1777, Burgoyne pushed south. He was going to come down the Hudson River and join up with a British force coming from New York and split the rebellious colonies in half. That didn't work out, and Burgoyne was defeated at the Battle of Saratoga. This had serious consequences for the American Revolution, because that led to the American-French Treaty of 1778, when France joined the fray, and it was all over. As you know, Great Britain lost the war, the United States became independent, you had the United States of America. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, as we talk about events in Western New Brunswick, or Western Nova Scotia, I should say, it's important to remember what other demands there were for troops in the Continental Army and also in the various colonial militias. And this priority to send troops elsewhere very much influenced what could happen in Western Nova Scotia. So this is the area mainly we're talking about, the lower St. John River Valley. Became British after the end of the 7 Years' War. The Acadians were expelled and the planters moved in. And by 1776, there were 4 major areas of settlement. Down here at the mouth of the river, there was the trading post of Simon, Hazen, and White. They ran a trading post, and they also ran a truck house. And of course, there were other settlers in this area and all along the river. But the other main area of planter settlement was here in Majorville. You go up, there's Okpak, and then above that, there is an Acadian settlement that is coalescing out of dispersed Acadians, probably where we would call French Village today. And of course, everybody living here had competing loyalties. And for the Wolastoqiyik, I hope I said that right, also known as the Maliseet, they were kind of split in 2 directions. Their Grand Chief, Pierre Thomas, led the pro-British faction, and Chief Ambrose St. Aubin led the pro-Patriot faction. And they were perhaps not unlike everybody else living in the area where their loyalties were split. The New England planters around Majorville primarily, well, as we will see, were mostly pro-patriot. The New England merchants at the mouth of the river were mainly pro-British because of their economic ties to the crown. And by and large, the Acadians remained neutral. Well, the Revolutionary War in Western Nova Scotia starts off with the privateers. And Machias, Maine, well, Machias district of Maine, Massachusetts, was a hotbed of privateering. And the first blow was struck by a privateer captain by the name of Captain Smith. And in September of 75, he sailed into the mouth of the St. John River, raided the trading post, burnt Fort Frederick, which had been abandoned some 8 years earlier, and captured a ship loaded with British stores. And there's Fort Frederick prior to its demise in the fire. And I think most of us have driven over it because I'm told it was where the old toll plaza was on the western approach to the Harbor Bridge in St. John. Now, rebellion, dissatisfaction with the British rule wasn't only in the 13 colonies, but it was very much in Nova Scotia as well. Many people had close ties with family and friends and business back to the New England states, and they were not happy with the way British rule was going. And they actively petitioned Massachusetts for aid. In fact, two of the people we're going to hear more about later on, Jonathan Eddy and John Allan, who were from the Sackville area, both had a price put on their head for their pro-rebel activities, and they had to flee to Machias for refuge. To help quell the unrest, Governor Francis Legg declared martial law in Nova Scotia on the 5th of December, 1775. And this seems to have quieted things down to some degree. In May of 1776, more privateers, and two of them came up in their boats to Majorville. And they rather bluntly suggested to the settlers that it would be in their best interest to join the revolution, because when the forecast invasion happened, it would be good for them to be on the right side. So they had a meeting on the 14th of May, 1776, and they held a vote. There were 137 electors, and the vote was 25 to 12 to join the revolution. And so they did. They formed a committee of public safety and put themselves under the protection of the Committee of Safety of Massachusetts. Now, a couple of the leaders in this were the Reverend Seth Noble and Jacob Barker, and I'm led to believe that some of their descendants may be with us tonight. So there you are. The 13th and a half colony had rebelled. So what about areas rebel sympathy? Well, we know Majorville. We also know there is an area around the Sackville area, but also in here you have Cobequid and Cumberland, very much an area of unrest, and also down in the Annapolis Valley in the district of Cornwallis. And someday I really must figure out what my planter ancestors there were up to. Which way did they go? I don't know. So as the privateers had foretold, yes, there was an invasion plan. And this was led by Colonel Jonathan Eddy. Excuse me. And I have to tell you, these were just not locally organized adventures. Eddy had met with the Continental Congress. Eddy had met with George Washington, and they all endorsed his invasion plan. So high-level planning, high-level authority. So Eddy left Machias on the 14th of October, 1776, made his way around to Majorville and picked up some reinforcements, which I will discuss later, went back down the river, and with his ragtag flotilla came up on the military outpost at Sympathy on the 29th of October, 1776, which they captured. And then there's a period here between the 29th and the 8th of November where it looks like not much happened, but that's not true because Eddie was busy recruiting people in the local area, especially out of Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, as we know it today. And the other intriguing thing is it appears that the garrison in Fort Cumberland was not aware of his presence till about the 8th of November. Because on the 8th, the Patriots captured Polly. Polly was a supply ship for the British garrison. It was bringing in their winter supplies. And because of the high tides, the ship was beached on the shore. And at low tide, fatigue parties from the fort were going down and offloading the ship. And one of the first things, or the first times they knew about the Patriots in the area, is when the fatigue party went down to offload the Polly and ran across the Patriots. A couple of days later, Eddie sent an ultimatum to the garrison at Fort Cumberland: surrender. However, that didn't happen. There's a bit of a stalemate because on the Patriot side, Eddie had brought about 26 people with him from Massachusetts, picked up 27 settlers from Majorville, 17 Loyalites fighters, including Ambrose St. Aubin, in the local area for Mi'kmaq, 21 Acadians, 25 settlers from Cobequid, 88 out of Cumberland, and 9 from Pictou. So it gave them a force of 217 people. Opposing them in the force was a garrison of the Royal American Fencibles. Now, they'd started off with a garrison of 268 people. Well, they lost 15 at Sympathy. They lost another bunch when the Polly was captured. There were other outposts captured. So by the time the ultimatum came, the garrison was down to 205 soldiers. Now, the garrison was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Gorham. Gorham was an experienced frontier fighter. He had commanded a company of New England Rangers during the 7 Years' War. He knew frontier warfare like the back of his hand. And he knew, given more or less the equal numbers and the fact that his troops were relatively inexperienced, it wasn't a good idea to go out and attack the Patriots because there's no guarantee it was going to go in their favor. It was far better to stay behind the walls of the fort and wait for help. So to that point, they sent messengers off to Halifax, and reinforcements did come in the form of 89 Royal Marines and 124 Highland immigrants. Excuse me. So that gave Gorham about a 2-to-1 advantage. So on the 29th of November, he sortied and attacked the Patriots, who promptly fled. And just to put this in terms of a map, started off in Machias, came up the St. John River, gathered reinforcements in Majorville, came back to St. John, Sympathy, and then Fort Cumberland. And after his defeat, Eddie and his band retreated up the Petitcodiac River portage route to Majorville, where it appears he wintered over and then proceeded upriver to Meductic and then took the Eel River portage route back to Machias. So those of you who are interested in transportation history, you will know that water and portage routes were the highways of the day. And there's a picture of Fort Cumberland in 1778. I'm sure we've all visited there either as Fort Beauséjour or Fort Cumberland. The following summer, Colonel Goold visited from Halifax, and he was accompanied by Major Studholme and a detachment of soldiers. One of their goals was to prevent Allan from establishing a truck house. The other goal was to return the residents to loyalty to the king. So he gave them, the settlers and the Wolastoqiyik, an opportunity to pledge allegiance to King George, or to renew their allegiance. And most of the settlers, if not all the settlers, did, and I can't speak for the Listocritic folk. I think some of them did too. So you would think at this point in time, the rebellion would be effectively over. Well, that would be optimistic thinking. Because what happened is the British again left the river and returned to Halifax, which left the door open for Colonel John Allan. Now, Allan had gone and talked to the Continental Congress, and he'd been appointed the superintendent of Eastern Indians. And his mandate was to protect the settlements of Eastern Massachusetts, prevent the British from using the Grand Communications route, and to free Nova Scotia from British control. So he invaded. He arrived in St. John on the 2nd of June, 1777 with 27 men. He left Captain West in the small garrison at the mouth of the river, and then he proceeded up to Ockpack. While he was there, he continued his intelligence gathering network, which was quite remarkable. He knew what the British were doing in Quebec almost as soon as they did. Plus, he had his spies working all through Nova Scotia. And he also continued to try to convince the Wolastoqiyik to side with him. Soon afterwards, Colonel Shaw appeared with a reinforcement of 40 men. But the promised regiment of 100 or 1,500 people never materialized, and Allan had counted on this. True to form, the British returned in June of 1777, 30th of June, and Studholme arrived with 120 troops. He did an amphibious assault landing on Musquash Bay and drove West and his party out of St. John. The next day, Colonel Michael Franklin, who was the Indian agent for Nova Scotia, arrived with 150 troops, and they pursued the Patriots upriver. When West got to Oromocto, he turned left and retreated up the Oromocto River portage route back to Machias. Meanwhile, the British continued upriver to Ockpack, and on the 6th of July, 1777, captured Allan's camp. Fortunately for Allan, there was only a rear guard in the camp because most of his group were meeting with the Wolastoqiyik in Mazerol's barn up, I guess, in the French settlement area. However, once the camp had been captured and the British force was there, Allan and his allies retreated upriver and across the Eel River route to Machias. I don't have a feel for how large the party was, but I've seen references of them having something like 27 canoes. So it's a fairly large party. And this, again, gives you an idea of his route from Machias, St. John, the battle at Musquash Cove, upriver, the battle at Ockpack, and then they retreat back down. I should say that Allan tried to minimize contact with the planters in Majorville. And one of the reasons for this was what happened after Eddie's defeat at Fort Cumberland, because the British troops there went on a spree of burning the barns and the homes of the rebels. And things were not nice for the families that had been left behind. And there's thought that Allan was trying to spare any Majorville residents who might have decided to rejoin the rebel cause from this. So Eddie's back in Machias, Allan's back in Machias, and back come the American privateers. And a wonderful privateer captain named Green Crabtree raided Portland in November 1777. And again, the businessmen, Hazen White and Simmons, petitioned to Halifax for assistance. And this time, they arrived. In November 1777, Studholme returned with troops and a couple of ships and built Fort Howe. As I said, this was in response to the privateer attacks. The following spring, in March and April, reinforcements arrived in response to reports of a third invasion. And this was brought on because you remember earlier in 1778, you had the American-French Treaty, and that brought all sorts of new plans within Massachusetts to reinvade Nova Scotia, but again, that never happened. Meanwhile, Allan continued to set the Wolastoqiyik against the British, and there were a series of treaties and counter-treaties. Oh, and there's Fort House, circa 1781. And if you've been to St. John, Fort House still stands there today. Somewhat changed, but it's still there. So I'd mentioned treaties. Ruth started off acknowledging the treaties of 1725 and onwards. The pertinent one here is the Treaty of Peace and Friendship in 1760, where the, excuse me, I guess I'll call them Wabanaki, pledged allegiance to the British Crown. In 1776, the fledgling American government made their first treaty with a foreign nation, and this was with the Wabanaki, the Treaty of Watertown. And among the conditions of this treaty, there was a plan to have a joint regiment in the Continental Army. About 250 men from Massachusetts and about 500 or 600 Wabanaki fighters. For various reasons, this never happened. And again, we have the American-French Treaty of February 1778. And Allan again used this to try to sway the Wolastoqiyik to join with the Patriots. And he had a powerful argument because, as you know, for many years they had pledged allegiance or been aligned with the French crown, and now the French were back. Things came to the head in September of 1778. And there was a war party of about 90 canoes coming down the St. John River. And James White, who was Franklin's deputy on the St. John River, went out to meet this group. And he managed to convince them to stop. And he invited them to a peace conference to be held at Fort Howe on the 24th of September, 1778. So this peace conference and treaty took place as planned. There were several days of celebrations, and speeches, and feasting, and exchanging gifts. And the upshot was that the Wolastoqiyik and the Mi'kmaq renewed their loyalty to the British Crown and renounced any treaties with the rebels, which included the Treaty of Watertown. They also returned any gifts or presents they received, including a wampum that George Washington had personally sent to them. Quite a momentous day. So what happened after 1778? Well, Allan continued to incite unrest, but had limited success. The Grand Communications route was open for the use of troop and courier movements. And Fort Hughes was built at Oromocto in 1780. One of the reasons for this was to protect the logging and masting operations that were taking place. The tall white pine trees that were growing in that area were essential to a sail-driven fleet of ships, especially the Royal Navy. Compare masts to oil. We were an oil-rich area at the time, at least in terms of masts. Another thing might have been to perhaps remind the settlers of their loyalties in case they decided to perhaps have other thoughts. And there's Fort Hughes rebuilt, as you know. I mentioned the Grand Communications route from St. John all the way up to the St. Lawrence River. It was the only way to communicate between Europe and Quebec City during the 5 to 6 months of the year when the St. Lawrence River was closed to shipping due to ice. Very important route. And in fact, the contest over the ownership of land in this area, the route of the border between British North America and the United States, almost led to the Third Anglo-American War in 1839. So to summarize things, obviously Western Nova Scotia spontaneously rebelled. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only area where a spontaneous rebellion was suppressed. The Patriots invaded the area twice, and of course their goal was to add Nova Scotia to the Patriot cause. But as I mentioned earlier, and several times, although these invasions had approval at the highest levels within the Patriot movement, Continental Congress endorsed it. The theater was of secondary importance, and the invading forces were greatly under-resourced. They just could not do it. So Sunbury County was retained for the crown. And I've discussed various factors influenced the inhabitants. The Wolastoqiyik, the Acadians, the merchants, and the planters. They all had various forces that were competing for their loyalty. And I suppose I ask you, if you lived in this area at the time, how would you have reacted? Would you have remained loyal to the crown? Would you have rebelled, or would you have tried to remain neutral? Could you have remained neutral? Hard to tell. There's some reading suggestions. Of course, I recommend the Road to Canada, in which I talk about the American Revolution in Western Nova Scotia, and later on about the Rustic War up in the Brunswick County, Maine, Madawaska, New Brunswick area. Two other stalwart books, The River St. John by Raymond, a good standby, lots of information. If you're interested in the siege of Fort Cumberland, I highly recommend Ernest Clark's book. And for those of you with roots along the St. John River, in the annexes, he has a list of all the people that he could identify who were either came out with the Patriots or were part of the British garrison of Fort Cumberland. So if you're from the area, have a look at the book, check out the references, see where your ancestors were. And if you don't have a copy of the book, in 1783, Studholme commissioned a census of the river. So the census results and Studholme's comments on the census are available from various sources. And if you Google Studholme census 1783, you should be able to find it. I know I did here a couple of days ago. And if historical fiction is more your forte, well, of course, there's His Majesty's Yankees, Typical Story, Family, I believe, in Liverpool, One for the Rebellion, One to Stay Loyal, and all the tangles that happen. The other one is Embers of War, similar situation, except the protagonist lived in Majorville. So folks, that is it. That is the story about the American Revolution in Western Nova Scotia, what happened and what transpired.
So, first question. Evelyn asked, was privateering sanctioned by the Congress, Patriots? So was privateering sanctioned?
Yeah, I believe so. Privateering was a very common thing by any warring party of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say so with great accuracy, but it's my understanding that it was.
Okay. Lynn Jones asked, what is a truck house? We've noticed you did say that word a few times.
It's a trading post, mainly to where you traded with the indigenous peoples. They bartered furs and other things for manufactured goods, especially guns, powder, and ball, because they had become dependent on those goods. Okay. So it was very, very important for them to have a truck house where they could do their trading. And this was one of the hooks that both parties were using to try to gain their loyalty.
Gleason's in Bangor asked, is what's being referred to as Eastern Massachusetts, in fact, Maine? In that area, Maine was a territory of Massachusetts.
Yep, it was. District of Massachusetts. Yep, no question there. Was it 1820 it became its own state? You have to switch between historic terms and modern day terms so people could follow the story.
Admin Racial Unity asks, why on earth did the rebels come from Massachusetts with so few soldiers? 29, 27, bring 300! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation point.
Supreme optimism, supreme optimism. You know, Eddie was told, don't go, Eddie, don't go. But Eddie went.
Kelly Grant asked, thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. I had wondered why there wasn't more interest in joining the patriot/rebel cause here in Nova Scotia, given so many close ties between planters in the New England colonies. And no question.
Well, as I indicated briefly, at one time I was looking into what the situation was or what the circumstances were where rebellion could occur. And as I pointed out, along the St. John River Valley, there was a vacuum of authority. The same way along the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. With the British all buttoned up in Boston, there were no British troops anywhere else. So the royal governors had to rely on the local militias, who a lot of them were for the rebellion. You know, so in a vacuum of authority, things happen. You just have to look at modern day. Look at Halifax and the Freedom Convoy. Vacuum of authority, they took over the city. You know, it took a lot to get rid of them. And the same way in the St. John River Valley, not once, not twice, maybe 3 times before the British realized to hold the area, they had to come back and have a presence. And the same thing, from what I understand, with mainland Nova Scotia, there were sufficient British troops in the area to prevent any serious uprising from happening. And I hearken back to my planter ancestors in the district of Cornwallis around Wolfville. The King's Orange Rangers marched a couple of companies into that area and formed another Fort Hughes in the area of New, just to keep an eye on the area and convince the planters that their loyalty lay with the crown. You know, so the potential was there, but it didn't happen.
Evelyn just popped up with a question. Was there a lot of destruction and looting in the rebel areas?
Along the St. John River Valley, no, there wasn't, because of the reason I mentioned. When Allan came back, he deliberately avoided contact with them lest there be reprisals. Around Sackville, Fort Cumberland, yes, there was. Barns and houses were burnt. Women and children were turned out into the winter cold while their husbands scattled over to Majorville. You know, it was rough going for them.
Barbara wrote, did some of the rebels move up to Carleton County when the Loyalists arrived?
Well, I'm not sure. Hal mentioned something about his relatives moving upriver when the Loyalists came in because they didn't like the new neighbors. The same thing happened for a lot of the Acadians, such as the ones up around French Village. They moved up to Madawaska and formed the Madawaska settlement because they didn't like the way the neighborhood was going downhill. Yeah, so there was some movement as the Loyalists arrived. They'd be thrown out of the 13 colonies. They'd lost their homes, and they weren't terribly sympathetic for people who had previously rebelled. You know, so yes, there was some movement.
Jay McGowan wrote, after the Loyalists, Reverend Jacob Bailey fled from Maine to Annapolis, Nova Scotia, did he play any role in the Nova Scotia New Brunswick battles in terms of his influence?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No? Okay. Evelyn asks, were rebel sympathizers removed of their land after the war, or at least some?
Not that I'm aware of. You know, the ones along the St. John River Valley recanted their evils and were accepted back into the fold of loyalty.
Stephen wrote, do family or local differences persist between New Brunswick Loyalists and Patriots?
I personally have no idea.
Not in my experience. No.
Hal, you got an opinion on that?
I have family in Massachusetts, and our origins are from there. My first ancestor in the river, Elijah Esterbrook, came here in 1760 after the French and Indian War. There's still an awful lot of back and forth, relatives on both sides of the thing. I think any animosity would stem from present day politics, not from the old ones.
This is Evelyn. If I can add, in Nova Scotia, there is still a lot of that because it was close to the town of Shelburne where there's a large planter settlement. And to this day, there's still tension between those of Loyalist descent and those of planter descent. Because as soon as the Loyalists moved into Shelburne, planters had to quickly make their way to Halifax to try to verify and stay their land claims. So yeah, there's definitely in some pockets of Nova Scotia.
I would like to remind everybody that next month we'll have another program on the third Thursday evening, and it's going to be with Ann Hemmerman, the geology of Fredericton reflected in its history. Now, Ann is with the UNB Geology Department, and she does a very interesting take on Fredericton's history. And that again will be via Zoom. Well, we hope to see you again next month. And if you do have any other questions, further questions, go ahead and contact the Fredericton Region Museum by email. They can be found at Fredericton Region Museum, all one word, at gmail.com. Or you can phone them at area code 506-455-6041. You can check out their website at www.frederictonregionmuseum.com or their Facebook page where it is always updated. So if that's everything, I guess I'll see you next month. Bye-bye.